On December 19, 1944, Dwight Eisenhower asked George Patton a question at Verdun. How soon could Third Army stop driving east, turn north, and attack the German flank in the Ardennes? Patton's answer was December 22nd, with 3 divisions. 3 days. The reaction in the room was disbelief. In some accounts there was laughter. The proposal sounded unreasonable for good reasons. Third Army was already fighting in another direction. To answer the crisis, formations would have to break contact, change their axis by 90 degrees, move roughly 100 miles over frozen winter roads, reposition artillery and supply traffic, and then attack. It looked like improvisation on an impossible scale. It wasn't. 10 days earlier, a colonel almost nobody remembers had warned Patton that the Allied consensus might be wrong. His name was Oscar Koch, Third Army's chief of intelligence. In early December, Allied commanders largely regarded the Ardennes as a quiet sector. The Germans had been driven back toward their own frontier. The common expectation was that they no longer had the strength for a major offensive in the West. Koch's section was seeing something else. Units identified elsewhere were no longer where they were expected to be. Radio patterns had shifted. Prisoner interrogations produced fragments that did not fit the reassuring picture. German air reconnaissance over the sector had increased. None of those clues by itself proved an offensive was coming. Koch did not pretend that they did. What he told Patton on December 9th was narrower and more useful. German forces appeared to have assembled the capability to attack through the Ardennes. The possibility was serious enough that Third Army should have a response ready before anyone could know whether the attack would actually come. That distinction matters. Good intelligence is not prophecy. It is disciplined uncertainty made operationally useful. For Patton, accepting Koch's warning created an immediate problem. Third Army was committed to its own offensive toward the Saar. Ammunition, road movement, staff attention, and command momentum all pointed east. Preparing to turn north meant spending effort on a contingency that the larger Allied intelligence picture did not consider likely. Patton ordered the staff to prepare anyway. Over the next several days, they worked out the road networks, movement tables, artillery displacement, and the code words that could trigger the change of front. Then on December 16th, the German offensive opened. The contingency stopped being theoretical. By the time Eisenhower asked his question at Verdun 3 days later, Patton's answer sounded reckless only because most of the room had not watched the preparation happen. The staff had already done the invisible work. Third Army attacked north on December 22nd. 4 days later, elements of the 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne. The famous image is Patton making a decision in a crisis. The more important image is much less dramatic. Intelligence officers reading fragments, staff officers building routes for a movement they might never execute, and a commander allowing work to begin before certainty arrived. Koch did not receive a dramatic battlefield reward for having challenged the prevailing assessment. What survived was Patton's later praise. In his own account of the war, Patton paid Koch a rare compliment, calling him the best damned intelligence officer in any United States command. That line is useful, but the real evidence came earlier. Patton had already spent resources on Koch's judgment before events proved him right. Patton later expressed his command philosophy in a sentence that has been repeated so often that it can sound like management advice. Never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. Read as a military principle, the difficult part is not the first sentence. The difficult part is the surprise. If a commander gives a subordinate an objective instead of a method, he is accepting that the solution may arrive in a form he did not design. The person closest to the road, the bridge, the riverbank, the radio report, or the enemy movement, may know something headquarters cannot see yet. That kind of command only works if judgment is allowed to move upward, as well as orders move downward. Patton did not need to borrow that idea from a German manual. The source connects it to the habits of cavalry command, and to an American army that had expanded too quickly to function through perfect central control. A cavalry commander could issue an objective, but the man several miles ahead was the one who could actually see the road, the enemy, and the ground. Headquarters could define purpose. It could not pre-write every useful response to a situation it had not yet observed. That is why the principle is more demanding than a slogan about creativity. The commander has to accept incomplete control in exchange for faster contact with reality. The subordinate, in return, has to understand the intent well enough to improvise without turning initiative into private adventure. But there is an obvious problem with using Patton as the symbol of that idea. He was not consistently a man others could safely challenge. In Sicily in August 1943, Patton visited evacuation hospitals and encountered two soldiers suffering from what the war called battle fatigue. Private Charles Cool had no visible wound. Patton called him a coward, struck him, and ordered him removed from the tent. About a week later, Patton encountered Private Paul Bennett, who was shaking and ill. Patton struck him too, drew his pistol, and demanded that Bennett be returned to duty. Both men were sick. Eisenhower eventually ordered Patton to apologize to the soldiers, to hospital personnel who had witnessed the incidents, and to his own troops. When the story became public, Patton's career was damaged. He spent months without a combat command and did not lead the Normandy invasion. There is no clean way to make that fit a heroic portrait. A commander who could trust a colonel against a broad intelligence consensus could also abuse a private who had reached the limits of combat endurance. That contradiction matters because it strips away an easy explanation. Third Army's initiative did not depend on Patton being gentle, patient, or morally consistent. It depended on a command arrangement in which he often wanted subordinates to solve problems, and in which useful decisions could survive the trip back up the chain. If that mechanism was real rather than merely personal, it should appear somewhere Patton was not in command. It did. On March 7, 1945, elements of the 9th Armored Division approached Remagen under 1st Army, not Patton's 3rd Army. Their mission was not to seize a Rhine bridge. Allied planning assumed the bridges would be demolished, and that crossing the river would require a deliberate assault later. Then Combat Command B came over the ground above Remagen and saw the Ludendorff Railway Bridge still standing. The plan and the ground no longer matched. Brigadier General William Hoge made the decision to exploit the opportunity. The bridge was mined. Nobody could know how long it would remain usable. Sending infantry onto it meant accepting the risk that the Germans might destroy it with men still on the span. Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion moved forward under Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermann. A German demolition charge went off as the Americans approached. The bridge lifted, came back down, and remained standing. Then Sergeant Alexander Drabik ran across under fire and was credited as the first American soldier across the Rhine there. He had not been assigned the symbolic role of being first. He simply moved faster than the men in front of him when the moment demanded it. What happened next is the mechanism in reverse. The decision did not begin at Supreme Headquarters and flow downward. It began at the river. A sergeant ran. A lieutenant committed his company. A brigadier general abandoned the expected route of his mission to exploit the bridge. The news climbed the chain to higher headquarters. Arguments followed because the bridgehead did not fit the existing campaign plan. Then Eisenhower settled the issue, exploit it. Bradley, by his own later account, welcomed the opportunity. But a senior operations officer at Supreme Headquarters argued that exploiting Remagen conflicted with the campaign scheme and would push forces into difficult country. That objection was not foolish. Plans exist because roads, terrain, supply, artillery support, neighboring formations, and future objectives have to fit together. A surprise bridge can create a dangerous liability as easily as a breakthrough. What mattered was that the objection did not automatically cancel what the men at the bridge had discovered. The plan was forced to answer the ground, instead of forcing the ground to obey the plan. The strategic plan adjusted to the opportunity found by men who had no authority to redesign the campaign. That distinction is crucial. Higher command did not create the opportunity. Higher command made the opportunity durable by refusing to erase the judgment that had already been made below. 2 weeks later, 3rd Army faced the Rhine farther south near Oppenheim. This time there was no intact railway bridge waiting to be seized. On the night of March 22nd, the 5th Infantry Division began the assault by launching small boats into the Rhine and sending troops across in darkness. There was no long preliminary bombardment announcing the attempt. No giant smoke plan running for days. No massive airborne component. The crossing was built around surprise, speed, and local decisions at the water's edge. By first light, American troops held ground on the eastern bank. The reported first night's losses were roughly 28 killed and wounded. That number is striking only if it is used carefully. It does not mean the Rhine was easy to cross, or that a hurried crossing was inherently safer than a deliberate one. It describes the opening cost of this particular bridgehead under these particular conditions. The operational achievement was not magic. It depended on finding a usable stretch of river, getting assault boats and troops to it, building support behind the first wave, and exploiting surprise before the defenders could turn a local crossing into a killing ground. Those are exactly the kinds of decisions that become slower when every detail must wait for approval from headquarters. A battalion or regimental commander standing near the river could judge current, bank, approach, resistance, and timing in a way an army commander looking at a map could not. Farther north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was preparing Operation Plunder, a deliberate crossing supported by enormous firepower, smoke, and airborne forces. The comparison is not that one method was intelligent and the other foolish. Plunder was a major set-piece operation with different forces, geography, and planning requirements. The contrast shows something else. An army can cross a river by concentrating enormous resources into a carefully synchronized plan. Or, under the right conditions, it can exploit a weak point quickly, because lower commanders are trusted to make decisions before a distant headquarters can see the same opportunity. Oppenheim required boats, engineers, infantry, artillery, communications, supply, and thousands of small acts of competence. It cannot be reduced to Patton's personality. The publicity came afterward. Patton called Omar Bradley, initially asked that the crossing not be announced until he knew the bridgehead would hold, then reversed himself and wanted the news released before Montgomery's assault began. 2 days later, he staged the kind of vulgar public gesture on a pontoon bridge that helped create the Patton legend. But the legend is almost the least interesting part of the crossing. The useful question is why an opportunity at a muddy riverbank could turn into an army-level action before a set-piece plan had been written for it. The answer was not freedom without discipline. It was preparation, clear intent, competent subordinates, and a chain of command willing to ratify judgment made close to the problem. The same pattern appears in Koch's warning. It appears in the Third Army turned toward Bastogne. It appears at Remagen. It appears again at Oppenheim. Different men, different headquarters, different problems. The common thread is that the person with the best information at the decisive moment was not always the person with the highest rank. There is a final historical irony in the argument. The German army had spent generations formalizing a version of this principle. Give commanders intent, allow them to adapt when circumstances change, and do not demand blind obedience to an order that no longer fits reality. Yet by the last years of the war, the political system above that army had made independent judgment increasingly dangerous. Senior officers could be dismissed for acting against Hitler's wishes. After the July 1944 attempt on Hitler's life, the consequences for perceived disloyalty could become far worse. A doctrine can survive in manuals after the behavior that makes it possible has disappeared. That is the danger of confusing written doctrine with institutional behavior. An army can teach junior officers to adapt, then punish the first highly visible officer who adapts against the wishes of political leadership. Once that happens often enough, the rational response is silence. Information still exists. Local judgment still exists, but fewer people are willing to attach their names to either one. That is the deeper point connecting Koch, Remagen, and Oppenheim. Decentralized command is often described as permission. Permission to improvise, permission to take initiative, permission to challenge assumptions. Permission is only half of it. The other half arrives after the decision, when senior leaders discover that someone below them acted on information they did not possess and created a result they did not design. Then the organization learns what its doctrine really means. Koch's warning was allowed to shape planning before the Ardennes attack proved him right. Hoge's decision at Remagen was allowed to stand even though the bridgehead disrupted the expected plan. The crossing at Oppenheim was exploited because local judgment moved faster than a formal set-piece process. None of those examples means every independent decision is correct. The risks at Remagen were real. The turn toward Bastogne required enormous staff preparation. Oppenheim succeeded under conditions that cannot simply be copied from one riverbank to another. Initiative without competence becomes chaos, but competence without room to act becomes delay. And fear can destroy the value of good information before anyone ever gives a bad order. The most revealing thing about those Rhine crossings was not who gave the order. It was how often the order came after the decision.